By 7:30 a.m., picking up from the previous installment, as the 300mm longer range rockets, which were massive and highly destructive, began landing throughout this very small 3 by 2.5 mile area at its widest north to south, typically 2 miles in width from north to south, but 2.5 at its widest where the rivers came close together at this fork. And the 3 mile long southern end and the longer end on the north as it bent perimeter of the downtown area was under heavy attack from these rocket systems, as well as also the 122mm multiple launch rocket platforms, the PHL-81s, that equipped the artillery battalion of the 8th Independent Brigade, whose forces in the form of 3 of its battalions, its 2 armored battalions and 1 of its mechanized infantry battalions, were smashing in to the southeast corner of the American defenses on the map, as the rocket artillery from their artillery battalion of the 8th Independent Brigade was showering the area with 122mm rockets, which were highly destructive, with multiple firing batteries comprised of 8 systems apiece, all targeting the same area at the same time, a time-on-target method, and they had done a creeping barrage this way to shower large areas, grid square by grid square, with these highly, hellishly destructive systems being added to now by a far more destructive system in the form of the PHL-03s, which equipped the PHL-03 Battalion of the 203rd Field Artillery Brigade, also part of the entire 68th PLA Group Army, whose heaviest formations were to the south and in the Fort Hood Battle, and the forces in the Waco Battle were more on the lighter end of its forces, although there were still some relatively heavy elements like the 8th Independent Brigade and also the 38th Infantry Brigade, which had some heavier maneuver elements like 1 Armored Battalion, as well as its very potent also Field Artillery Battalion, which wasn't quite a maneuver element, but it was there to support its maneuver elements in the form of the very potent PLL-66 152mm howitzers, as well as also the divisional artillery, which was contained within the 13th Light Armor Brigade, part of the 288th Light Infantry Division, along with the 3rd Light Infantry Regiment and the 14th Light Infantry Regiment, as well as the Independent Headquarters Battalion and Independent Support Battalion, which early on had moved into the TSTC Airport to take control of that particular area, as all of the fighting was going on throughout the entire Waco metropolitan area. As to the direct southeast of the southeastern corner of the fighting occurring in the downtown area, the very heavy, potent strike forces of 3 different armored battalions, 1 Russian armored battalion joining the battle from the 16th Tank Division, having left Fort Hood in pursuit originally of these mixed American elements, only 1 of which making it barely with their lives into the relative, at the time, safety of the downtown pocket to take over and manage its defenses, as there were combat engineers who had specialty skills. Plus, they had claymore mines and also M19 plastic mines, which were anti-tank mines with very minimal metal components, making them difficult to detect with metal detectors, which they ended up using as part of the defenses, as originally they were planning on setting these mines up and practicing clearing minefields with their line charges from their M1150 armored engineering vehicles, but instead found a better use by using them as actual defenses in the Waco area, something that was not typically available throughout the entire nationwide invasion, as it was very rare that these systems had been signed out from the various ammo bunkers inside of American installations, as the installations were the first to go, and to be rapidly overrun with very heavy maneuver elements, or cruise missiled and tactical ballistic missiled out of existence, or a combination thereof, as well as also being hit extremely heavy by artillery and airstrikes as well. With air power, at least for the first hours of the invasion, primarily focused mostly on installations, with minimal other types of targets, primarily big cities as well, but for the most part, installations were the very first to be targeted by air attack, as well as making sure that the USAF assets that actually were in the air at the time of the invasion beginning, like combat air patrols that were standard, being shot down immediately. As these forces smashed into the defenses and the fighting in downtown took on a hellish twist, with very many Americans fighting desperately to defend their new defense lines, there were different rings of defenses being built throughout the Waco area to make it very tedious for the PLA troops to have to clear, as there was a constant threat that at any point in time from behind them could come American sapper-type elements that would come up out of the manholes and try to ambush the flanks of these forces as they surged forward and began to clear these different blocks of the city, which all, for the most part by now, had defensive positions contained therein per city block. As the PLA armored forces, which were comprised of their tank companies, armored infantry companies, and single anti-tank company, which usually had either the very powerful AFT-10s or the even more powerful QN-506s, which were typically what equipped the active duty PLA anti-tank companies per armored battalion. These forces were laying down enormous fire on the American defenses, as these were very potent maneuver elements indeed, along with the Russian armored forces, which had an anti-tank company with the BMPT Terminator anti-tank vehicles, along with the Chi-coms that were set up in a similar manner. They now were battering the American defenses in this particular sector, and the Americans were beginning to now run out of vehicles, although they still managed to save some of them by putting them within the relative safety of the parking garages, although these would end up being destroyed sooner rather than later, as they would not be able to withstand the tandem strikes from artillery, cruise missiles, which would come in quite soon and finish them off, as well as even tactical ballistic missiles that would be a simple redundancy to the cruise missile and artillery strikes, as the very powerful DF-15C bunker-busting cruise missiles would end up being fired by the 616th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade after using many of them against the military installations and political bunkers that were around the nation. They would now switch to these ancillary targets, these tertiary targets, such as the American defenders in the big cities, including the medium city of Waco, as it had its holdouts using these very strong structures to protect their vehicles, at least for a time. Eventually, there would be no more vehicles, as these extremely powerful missiles would come in and finish them off. And as these forces now were essentially striking this area, just to their immediate west was the combat engineers of the PLA 38th Infantry Brigade's Combat Engineer Battalion, who had arrived into the area after having destroyed a cluster of armed reactionary civilians that materialized near I-35 after they had previously annihilated a grouping of mixed military forces and armed reactionary civilians that had gotten stuck in a very difficult neighborhood and were compressed in a small space, and the heavy firepower from these combat engineers, along with the drones and loitering munitions, simply annihilated these forces before they rapidly advanced to take on and destroy this small group of reactionary armed civilians, supported by the 122mm rocket fire from the artillery battalion of the 8th Independent Brigade, before they moved north and began to take on the American defense line with their very capable forces, which were equipped with the GCZ armored engineering vehicles, which could also fire plastic explosive line charges fired by rockets, and they had plows and they had earth movers that could dismantle as well as construct defensive positions themselves, much like the American M1150s, which were their armored engineering vehicles. as they now separated the heavier forces fighting on the east and also from the southeast corner of the PLA and Russn Army battalion from the 16th Tank Division in the area from the 2nd Combined Arms Army. The Russian Armored Infantry, which was essentially mechanized infantry but within a tank unit, the 16th, was advancing to the area beside the combat engineers of the 38th Infantry Brigade, but also to their west was the PLA Mechanized Infantry Battalion, also of the same 38th Infantry Brigade, holding the area from Lake Waco to where they met with the Russians near the middle of the line in the south. As this particular area was now being heavily bombarded by 300mm rocket strikes as well as continued howitzer fire from the 38th Infantry Brigade's own 152mm PLL-66 howitzers, as well as also the rocket fire from the 8th Independent Brigade's rocket artillery of the artillery battalion that equipped them with the 122mm rockets. Most of the divisional artillery, the 155, which was also very powerful for a howitzer ammunition round, of the 155 PCL 181s that equipped the divisional artillery of the 288th Light Infantry Division within the 13th Light Armor Brigade, which is one of its comprising units that made the division, was now mostly firing off map and out of the area to support their other 7 battalions operating outside, guarding the flanks for this operation, generally firing at clusters of armed reactionary civilians that were trying to challenge the PLA and their situation as they now controlled the entire Waco metro area and were beginning to push out beyond. And as they pushed out, they were being challenged by groupings of armed reactionary civilians, some of them militia-type forces like those encountered by the combat engineers of the 8th Independent Brigade earlier, as they had a fortified compound that the engineers destroyed with ample help from loitering munitions, as well as this group of mixed military personnel that had actually gone under I-35 and gone far out of their way into the east before being destroyed. Downtown, and the southern portions of the defensive line, the PLA Mechanized Infantry platoons comprising one of their companies operating in the area with another company behind them as they could rotate between one another and leapfrog over each other too as they took territory in the downtown area. The combat engineers and the mechanized infantry were both equipped within their platoons with one ZBD-04A infantry fighting vehicle, which was a very powerful infantry fighting vehicle indeed, with its 100mm main gun, its 2 anti-tank missile pods, which gave it a true tank busting capability with its HJ-09 anti-tank pods, 2 of each per turret, as well as its very powerful 30mm autocannon, which could fire HE armor-piercing or armor-piercing HE ammunition, as well as others. And they had also their laser and IR scrambling capabilities like the Type 96Bs and Type 99A main battle tanks of the PLA. They equipped the combat engineers with a GCZ-112 per platoon, 1 of these per platoon for the combat engineers, and 3 of the Type 89As per platoon of the combat engineers, whereas the mechanized infantry had 4 of these and 1 ZBD-04A infantry fighting vehicle per platoon. As the PLA and Russians, again, were operating side by side and cooperating in this particular part of the campaign to seize downtown, their forces of this mechanized infantry or armored infantry company from the 16th Russian Tank Division of the 2nd Combined Arms Army of the Russn Army were moving through this area. There was a platoon here, and their 3rd combat platoon off-map handling the next block over as the PLA forces were operating to their immediate west, with dismounted PLA troops, having freshly moved in through this area, as well as their vehicles, were now moving into this area here, and here, as well as here, clearing these city blocks. These were urban housing areas with urban-style homes in the downtown area, as there was very small yards, and they were very close together with thin stretches of walkways between these buildings, and the backyards were relatively small. This area had a fence that was badly damage from the shelling that occurred here, and this building had been gutted horribly, with many of its floors exposed as the walls had collapsed and there was no more facade in many areas of these buildings, as well as parts of the roofs pancaking in. And the same happened as this gas station and restaurant connected to it were horribly gutted right here. This was a group of stores with a parking lot on the other side. Now, as the defenses were rather strong throughout the entire perimeter, as the American combat engineers, including one armored engineering vehicle here and another one here, both being the M1150s, had helped in constructing certain anti-tank / machine gun positions like these little makeshift bunkers out of rubble and sandbags and other materials that were easily found in this dilapidated city that was now horribly just rubbled with very few exceptions. This one being built into the rubble here. They were now being hit by a whole variety of systems. This cruise missile moving through the area was seeking a target to destroy, going for one of the suspected command centers. Although it could have hit this parking garage, it continued on looking for a suspected command center that was put into its targeting data. As the modern fluid battlefield had changed, the targeting data on the container-based, container-disguised cruise missile systems like the Chinese YJ-18Cs and the Russian Club Ks, which were calibers, could be updated as time went on, which is why they were fired in different salvos from 2 a.m. all the way till 10 a.m., because battlefield conditions were constantly changing and new targets presented themselves, as the original targets to be hit first and second in the first and second salvos had already since been hit, and now it was a matter of new targeting data being updated for the follow-up salvos of missiles to go after, this one being targeted to seek out a suspected command center as it flew over this area right above the strikes from the 300 millimeter rocket salvos from the PHL-03 systems firing from Nolanville outside of Fort Hood, just slamming into this area and utterly annihilating rubble and throwing more rubble around as it struck, as this place became a hellscape of destroyed buildings and craters and more. As the PLA Mechanized Infantry Bttn had its fire support company in addition to its 6 mechanized infantry companies and its headquarters and support company, its fire support company sat even further back and was firing its 130 millimeter light artillery, multiple launch rocket systems, its Type 63s, at this office building right here beyond this gas station and shop parking lot. As these were apartments, this was a urban housing area right here, and apartments. This was where the businesses began in this particular area right here when it came to the actual urban design. As far as the urban planning and zoning was concerned, the businesses were in this particular area as well as here, but they also had apartments and urban housing in this particular area of the city as well. And the Russians were busy clearing these large apartment structures here and here, these buildings not having as of yet been destroyed, while these had been horribly gutted with the floors exposed. Same was the case with these, and over here, these houses had been horribly maimed and shredded up from the most recent artillery strikes here. This building horribly gutted, it could be seen inside of. As the PLA forces advanced and they had companies moving up behind the lead companies that were attacking, they had follow-up forces moving through the area to watch these manhole covers. This was being a fenced-in area right here between these homes. These were the yards of the homes. This was a fenced-in area that contained a manhole cover for the local drainage/sewer system. And as these two half squads moved into the area, there was a squad of American soldiers coming out of each end, but they were spotted by the quadcopter ISR assets and they were liquidated, including with assistance from this turret gunner firing through this house, as indicated by the red on this home, firing through it at this squad right here. As these forces exchange fire here, And these forces exchange fire this way here, and they all vectored their weapons to not cause friendly fire as per their ISR assets directing everything. Hand grenades were thrown from both these troops here, these two half squads, watching these two fighting positions, which used to be houses, where these two full squads are, firing over at these areas here, whereas these two half squads were watching for a time this area right here. After they eliminated these personnel coming up out with the help of the vehicles, they now moved into the area right here. This half squad moved here, and this half squad moved up beside this squad, who was already laying down fire here and was taking fire from American vehicle-based fire from this APC at first, and from some of these troops coming around the side firing. But they eventually would go into this store right here as these two loitering munitions came down and destroyed with their heat warheads. These two CH-901As destroyed these two MRAPs, as the MRAPs equipped most of the airborne troops of the 143rd, although they still did have some of their M1301s and M1297 vehicles, which were the Army High Mobility Ground Vehicles, which are the M1297s. They were being replaced by the M1301s before they had been then, as a unit, tasked out to defend Waco and were given instead MRAPs. So they had a myriad of these older original vehicles they had, plus some of the ones that replaced them, and also now MRAPs, as they were tasked out with this mission and were given the MRAPs. So they had a slew of different vehicles. There were two American companies, the Charlie and Delta Company, operating in this area of the 1st of the 143rd Battalion of the 143rd. So as these two half squads moved between this house and this house here and this house and the other house next to it, they had finished off these personnel before then advancing up and moving alongside these two full squads and these two half squads that were watching their backs. As the two full squads were laying down fire into this area, the half squads prepared to advance along with these two full squads. As they prepared to bound and cover together, leaving these two half squads to hold the area, this full squad here, bounded ahead, intending on taking this corner for these others to bound and clear the gas station and the other buildings like these stores. But what happened instead, when they bounded here, and this half squad and this half squad, the half squad bounded here and the other half squad bounded here, they bounded ahead, and they got hit by a disguised improvised device that had nails and ball bearings and all that. It was hidden in a trash can and well camouflaged, as oftentimes next to gas stations and their ancillary facilities, they have a lot of propane tanks sitting out and trash cans. It was well hidden in a trash can, and when it went off, it completely KIA'd this entire 10-man squad, giving these PLA troops, this half squad and this half squad, some pause before they decided they had to go in for the wounded. So this half squad went in and cleared this building out while this one moved ahead here to check on the wounded. Then this one moved out of the building after they cleared the gas station rapidly and moved to tend to the wounded, but there was nobody left. They'd all bled out from being maimed and also having some arteries cut in the neck area where the men didn't have their collars up on their body armor and instead had taken shrapnel in the neck, and they had bled out profusely and perished. So these troops had to move back to this area, bringing all the KIA'd back, these 5 men. So they had to make 2 trips, as this arrow indicates, as they went back. So they pulled all the KIA back to some cover where these 2 half squads were. And this squad went around here and still held the corner while they were doing this. So this half squad was here while they were moving the corpses back, as they were going to be evacuated with their KIAs and their equipment out of the area, including their personal weapons, which before the first ambush that had ever occurred with an improvised device allowed the Americans to get to some of the PLA equipment before the follow-up squad was even able to intervene and stop this, as they went down into the sewer with these things, with these items, with these weapons, as they had set the improvised device relatively near their manhole cover and had a tripwire for it. Well, there was a tripwire for this, and they were KIA'd. There was also a tripwire for this, too, for any forces that would attempt to dismantle the minefield, which would either need a mortar or artillery strike, but in that case, they would have to then be checked to ensure that all these were destroyed, as it would be best for combat engineers to do it with their line charge, and the combat engineers were operating off to the east, and they would have to be called up to dismantle these mines. They could see these mines by the ISR capabilities as well as this device because they were out in the open and could be seen. Even this improvised device. This one could not be, as it was extremely well camouflaged amid all these other things that already showed up on the ISR with the infrared. They showed up next to the propane tanks and all the other junk that sat outside, and it was well hidden, as sometimes that could occur. Well, these troops, this full squad, went into this rubbled gas station after they had checked it and got their deceased out of the area, and they held this position. And they were now laying down fire over on the troops over here. These troops then went into this store after witnessing the destruction very, very soon before they went in there of these vehicles, also getting a few of their men injured as a result that were on the edges of these blasts that destroyed these two MRAPs. They went into the store to take cover. As this battle would be a long and drawn-out battle, it was not anywhere near its conclusion yet. As all of this was going on, everything else all along this front was going on all at the same time. But like in every other video, it's difficult to explain it in a coherent order, so it'll be attempted, but it's very difficult. As that occurred, the 130mm rockets striking this building had been called in with the ISR quadcopter assets, seeing personnel run into this building as well as seeing them inside the windows on the upper floors as these hovered around. They called in the 130mm strikes from the fire support company that was part of the same battalion that this full company of troops was part of, and the follow-up company coming up behind them, as there were other companies off-map by the lake. This was a 1-mile area by 1 kilometer in total width and length, north to south and east to west in width. As these forces, these 5 vehicles of this platoon, had moved forward at the same time their troops went in here to offer them vehicle support, they were firing their 30mm autocannon and 100mm main gun at these forces attempting to conduct a counterattack coming out of this parking garage. These M1297 vehicles and one of their MRAPs. As the fire had been coming from the IFV for quite some time, they had already destroyed these lead vehicles while this one got here and was destroyed. These were already destroyed by infantry fighting vehicle fire and loitering munition strikes as they tried to move down the street. They were KIA'd at the very opening of this map. They were all destroyed. As these troops right here would be KIA'd from artillery strikes, as howitzer artillery would imminently come in along with these mortar strikes hitting right outside this building, got one of the personnel right here coming out from this alleyway on the other side of the city block. As that was happening, mortars, 120mm mortars from the PLL-05s were striking and KIA'ing the troops on top of this parking garage that had moved up here for a time, along with the rocket strikes as they were on the periphery and getting some of the shrapnel from that as well, which wiped them out, along with this MRAP right here and a mortar strike that got these guys here and these guys here at the opening of the map, as well as these 8 guys that were doing a rolling shield, double column rolling shield behind their vehicle, and by the time the last 2 survivors in the vehicle got here, they were wiped out by the IFV fire. As soon as that happened, all this was happening at about the same time, with the rocket strikes getting the edges of this building. Only the vehicles on the first floor were relatively well protected, as the top floors were being inundated by shrapnel, and the top highest floors were having troops wiped out by the mortar strikes and a loitering munition strike on a MRAP, on a Max Pro MRAP with a 50 cal that was monitoring these streets as it was hit and destroyed. And the artillery came in soon thereafter. As these artillery strikes were coming in, the PLA troops at the same time as this double column rolling shield beside their infantry fighting vehicles, the infantry fighting vehicle took some engagement from the machine gunners firing into it and doing absolutely nothing to it. And these troops over here were laying suppressive fire on these forces. They moved up and then they ceased fire. But then this squad went into this gutted building and had to clear it of these 8 troops that formed a full squad of American troops. As they were laying suppressive fire, they held their fire while their men went in. And then they shifted all their fire over here. Because now, as they shifted fire here, this squad was going to move forward and break up into 2 half squads while the other full squad was clearing out this building. As it's all in red, that means they had either wiped all of them out or taken them as POWs, but in this case they had wiped them all out. Now we're firing and throwing grenades out of the gutted parts of the facade at these personnel that were in this rubble trench that was formed out of these gutted buildings and destroyed building right here, while these troops climbed up on top of the rubble and were laying down on it, throwing hand grenades and firing tube-fired grenades. They're 35mm grenades. The Russians had 25mm barrel-fired grenades. They had 35, the PLA, and they were firing them at these forces. They managed to get one over here that KIA'd 3 personnel, who the other 5 survived and ran into this manhole cover, as did these troops right here under fire, because now artillery was striking this area, along with the fire from the infantry fighting vehicle hitting this area, and the strikes from the loitering munitions, and then artillery fire. This whole bunker had been destroyed right here by the end of this parking lot that was constructed with sandbags and rubble. This was a machine gun and an anti-tank position. It had been destroyed by this point by all the artillery strikes. This artillery strikes helped to destroy the rest of these personnel, along with all the fire from the IFV, 30mm autocannon, 100mm fire, 7.62 by 54mm coax fire. These troops went into the sewer system to get away from the artillery bombardment, while these troops moved up slightly, and were now battling with these troops down in here. Eventually they had KIA'd all of them, including the troops behind this barricade, where the rubble's cascading a bit in the street, where there's enemy troops right here too, with these vehicles moving up and engaging them. They're 30mm HE APHE autocannon ammunition shredding through these barricades and wiping these personnel out with ease, with their 100mm gun fired as well into this bunker, who's also now, after these troops were KIA'd and their barricades completely obliterated with scrap metal being thrown in different directions from the 30mm HE ammunition and 100mm ammunition, with them now firing through this area, as they were originally there as a fallback position, but now that their men in front had been KIA'd and these others had gone into the sewer for protection from artillery, they were laying down heavy fire until they themselves were destroyed by 2 HJ-09s being fired from the 2 pods on this system. As that happened, artillery landed and destroyed what was left of it anyway, along with although the rubble protected it from the back from any of these rocket strikes, the follow-up howitzer strikes caused these troops to try to evacuate. As these troops safely got out of the area when the artillery began falling, these troops had all been KIA'd in the 3rd line. The combat engineers made 3 different trench lines as they plowed rubble and scooped rubble out of these areas where buildings used to stand. And although there were still rubble as the floors of these trenches, there were still piles of it, they had basically put the scooped rubble into organized parapets where they could fire over. They had like trenches made of rubble, and although the artillery came down, all ISR directed and KIA'd these 2 squads, these 2 got away. They managed to get in there safe with their lives. As this PLA half squad, or full squad, broke into 2 half squads and was engaging these troops as the artillery fell, these 2 squads were KIA'd, but these 2 got in there safely because they would come back up and recapture their positions, as the fighting here was especially savage. Just like the 2 half squads were fighting these troops over here, and these troops escaped with their lives, and so did these. And they would come back as well. Fighting over these city blocks was savage like that. Artillery would be called in, then they would come back up and retake their positions and fight over them, and then they would have to recapture positions and force them out, and then they would try to come up afterwards and conduct these type of flank attacks like right here. I mean, it was a constant duel between these forces for control of these areas. With this full squad and 2 half squads moving up here along this ripped up fence, it was like a chain link fence, they were just watching this manhole cover to guard their other forces that were right here, as this full squad moved in to take their position as they moved up along with their vehicles. Same thing was going on here. This double column formation of troops moved in and straightened out in a line formation as this squad moved up, broke into 2 half squads, supported by covering fire from this squad right here, who also covered these 2 double column rolling shields, one on the right side, one on the left of this Type 89A and this ZBD-04A, who both bounded and covered tactically. They bounded first, held their positions, laid down fire with covering fire. Then they bounded ahead and took their position, throwing grenades into these trench systems, and then they broke into 2 half squads, and these guys ceased fire there, and then they began to take these positions out bit by bit. At first, before they even advanced, they were laying down 100 millimeter fire and 30 millimeter autocannon fire, and even their coaxial machine gun fire into these positions as well. They even fired over them and hit this armored engineering vehicle, destroying it, along with mortars landing as this vehicle barely escaped with its life. This M1297 moved in here and was hit by mortars, 120 millimeter mortars from the fire support company, and an artillery strike with a 152 shell, just like the shells hit here. And KIA'd these guys who didn't even make it to the sewer system like these two did. They were in the second trench behind these forces under attack. As that happened, the artillery was very close, but not danger close. It would have been danger close had it been right here by the manhole. But these forces were prevailing for a time, but they would have to take a long time to fight over each and every city block, as the troops would come back out of the manhole covers, even the reactionary armed civilians assisting them in the defense here, and they would fight over each and every block like this, because the defenses were extremely well built, as you can see. As one can observe, the gutted buildings and the rubble buildings were excellent fighting positions as it stood, but then the trenches that had been constructed, along with supporting pillboxes for machine gun and anti-tank guns, which were mutually supporting in many cases, made it very difficult to capture these areas, hence the methodical nature of the forces moving through and leapfrogging the way they were leapfrogging, with forces moving in to cover the manhole while these other forces would move up and take the place of a squad that was bounding ahead. Then they would have to watch the manhole cover, because enemy forces would come back up after a barrage and restart the engagement all over again, because they were behind their trench lines. And it would go on like that for some time, but eventually the attrition, it was aggressive attrition at that was being withered upon these forces. It was being they were being attrited, they were being withered down by these forces and their attacks with their loitering munitions and their cruise missile strikes, their rocket strikes from light artillery, rocket artillery, their mortar strikes, their massive artillery strikes, and howitzer strikes would attrit them over time. It would eventually wear them down. These strikes would KIA these troops right here. This whole squad would be gone. Although loitering munitions got this Bradley from the mixed military unit, got this M1150. Loitering munitions and infantry fighting vehicle fires and also mortars and artillery strikes got all of these counterattacking forces that came up out of the parking garage. And there were still more in there, safely on the first floor for now. But they were gradually losing vehicles and troops as time went by, because all the ISR-directed strikes from rocket artillery, loitering munitions, mortars, and howitzer-based artillery was simply too massive to ignore. And the rocket artillery from the 300mm rockets and the cruise, and even especially the tactical ballistic missile strikes, could not be withstood, and eventually would take their toll, as the strikes and their frequency of strikes would increase over time, as more and more artillery would be better coordinated as the troops advanced and the ISR network spotted more and more targets appearing. They would launch more and more artillery, rocket artillery, including the 300mm, but also their 122mm and their howitzer strikes and their heavy mortar strikes and light artillery rocket strikes. More and more would be launched, as well as just salvos and volleys of loitering munitions, whether the CH-901As, which could be fired at one time in a massive quantity of 48, or the Russian ones, which could be reloaded quicker, but they could be fired only 5 at a time, but they could still get a lot of them out relatively quick. These would just swamp the battlefield and seek targets until eventually the attrition would just become too much, although the Americans did have some things going for them, like the ability to quickly get into manholes and ride out the strikes. By the time they would come back up, the ISR assets would notice them, and the troops proceeding to clear the areas would be supported by the loitering munitions and their vehicles, but they would have small successes like they did with this improvised device, eliminating an entire PLA squad. And they would also hold up the PLA with certain types of traps like this, because the PLA could see all this. They knew this was there. The claymores were there, which were anti-personnel. They could not send personnel out necessarily to just clear these, because the claymores would get them, or the improvised device, and if they fired at it and blew some of it away, there was no guarantee that they basically didn't have some that were live laying around or defective that might go off if they were laying around still for their troops clearing the areas. So they had to get rid of these the right way, with either the combat engineers launching their plastic charge, or they would have to direct a very powerful artillery strike onto this whole area and just do it that way. But because it was in such close proximity of the troops, that would mean their troops would have to go back. So what instead they planned on doing was to go around it and leave it for the combat engineers to deal with later. Otherwise, it would just take way too much time and effort to get rid of this. But it did work in slowing them down. It did do that. But in other areas where there were no such things, they would just go around this type of situation. But there were other areas where there were some mine emplacements like that as well, and they would have to be dealt with in similar fashion. The combat engineers operating to the immediate east would be the best forces to deal with it overall, or the artillery forces, but again, because they were in such close proximity and they had to advance, they were not going to risk an all-out artillery strike on this area while their troops were so close and now had captured this portion and were holding it from inside this gutted building and this pile that used to be a building, as well as in this gas station. They weren't going to risk all that, so they would just go around it for the time being until the engineers could come and deal with it later. And as these troops fought over each and every trench line, as they fired over the trench lines at these American vehicles and also their bunkers, and had to destroy them with anti-tank missiles or loitering munition strikes, or also in some cases later cruise missile strikes, and also even heavy mammoth artillery strikes from their humongous 300 millimeter or their 122 millimeter or howitzer directed fire that was precision on these bunkers to make sure they were destroyed. They would deal with them, but it would take time again, as even though they would capture the city in just under 2 full days and would still be a record time, this was still an arduous process. No matter how one looked at it, it was still an arduous process of going block by block, which took a few hours each block. And because the city that was being held, the downtown, was not an exceptionally massive area, it would be captured relatively fast, but it still took time. Overall, it took hours per block because it had to be done methodically and carefully, because the PLA was risk averse. They did not want to unnecessarily sacrifice units to do something they could do anyway if they were just more careful. The same went for the Russians. They had learned this in the Great Eastern European proxy conflict in the early 2020s. And eventually, the casualty rate there was exceptionally in the Russians' favor, because they did not needlessly sacrifice their forces when artillery and loitering munitions could do the job and missiles for them. And it often did, before they sent in their maneuver elements to clean up. In this instance, the BMP-3 leading these MTLBs, which were the Russian armor personnel carriers, and the infantry fighting vehicle being the BMP-3, were moving through this area of this platoon, this other platoon, the same thing. And they had their third combat platoon of this company of armored infantry, which was mechanized infantry, but within an armored unit, the 16th Tank Division. They had moved in and cleared this large apartment structure, this urban housing block right here. And as they sent 2 squads in here, they had another squad here and another squad here around this building, and they had another squad right here. This was a full platoon taking this block right here, coming from these vehicles. And this platoon was taking this block. And by the time they sent 2 squads in here, they had another squad right here, half squad, half squad. They had another squad back here a bit. They would send their forces to capture this building, and they were taking fire just like the PLA troops, as indicated by all agreeing. This was a long exchange of fire. This went on for many minutes because it was a firefight, and they had to put down supporting fire for their troops to get across, and their other troops had to take their place in case they had to fall back and, bring casualties back and take breaks and alternate, they would do it like that, and they would pour down supporting fire from vehicles and lines of troops, firing everything from their Type 69 enormously mass-produced RPG rounds, firing their 35mm grenades, firing their light machine guns, their QBJ 201s, firing their general-purpose machine guns, their vehicle-based fire, heavy machine gun fire from vehicles. They would do all of that, and that's how they would get their troops across methodically, just like this double column rolling shield. This vehicle moves up so their troops can just flank off the vehicle on the right side and go into this building and clear it out. And they did it that way, where the vehicles and troops offered mutual support to one another, even in the back, with these machine gunners laying down heavy fire before these troops moved up, as they had all assisted one another in destroying these attempted infiltrators coming up from the manhole covers, who tried to disrupt the troops from behind them or beside them, as done in the previous installation as well. As these forces captured this building, they were being supported by Lancet 3 loitering munitions, the Russian loitering munition, as well as there being one here as well. There were 5 in this volley right here, and would contribute to hitting the forces behind this area. This M113 armor personnel carrier would be annihilated by a 100mm shell coming from this BMP-3, leading this column of MTLBs, which were the armor personnel carriers. And they destroyed this and the barricade with the troops behind it, because they too had a 30mm autocannon that just shredded these forces up. And although there was rubble cascading down in the middle of the street, some of it could be traversed by tracked vehicles, although in some areas it was just way too thick that it couldn't be traversed or it couldn't be brushed out of the way. But here, it was just narrow enough that just wide enough, not too narrow, where they could get through it. And then they got to the end right here, and they were laying down fire here. But in order to do that, they had troops and loitering munitions clear this area. This trench area right here that used to be an alleyway between buildings was now hit by a Lancet 3, where all these KIAs occurred. After these troops cleared this entire building of a whole platoon, there was an entire American platoon holding this building. 2 squads went in, and 2 half squads were outside, and another squad over here to watch for any persons trying to flee over into this building, this gutted building here. And they cleared it. These 2 squads went through room by room, hallway by hallway, and it took them 2 hours to do this, because these were other troops they were fighting that knew tactical formations, and it was difficult and arduous, and they lost some of their troops doing it. But they eventually captured this as their vehicles rolled forward, supported by PLA troops on this block watching this manhole cover, and 2 more squads moving up adjacent to these buildings here. And these 2 half squads were laying down heavy fire on this barricade here with troops behind it, firing RPG rounds, even an HJ-08 anti-tank missile at this group, also 35mm grenades, and they were returning fire with 203s and also their own 40mm grenades from the Americans. They were firing their weapons at the PLA troops. They wounded one, but they didn't KIA any of the PLA troops, because by this time these other troops, this squad broke into 2 half squads. This full squad advanced up here after they bounded first, and then laid fire down for them to bound ahead and then get and lay up on the rubble and fire over it. And they broke into 2 half squads and did the same, with the fire now shifting or being held as this half squad outflanked these guys and fired down in an L shape, classic L shape, with this other one firing this way to hold the flank. While they did that, the Russians were clearing these blocks here as they were moving up to join the PLA who was working on this one. And as they moved in, they got all these personnel. As these squads had cleared this out, they, along with their vehicles moving up, they were laying down heavy fire into this group and destroyed them with 100mm shell fire, 30mm autocannon fire. And the troops, after clearing this, they were firing out the windows and the walls that were collapsed at these Americans holding this area here. And they wiped them all out, and they began then to fire 25mm grenades from beneath their AK-74M rifles, or firing their RPK-74 light machine guns, and also RPG-29s at these personnel down in here, and they were wiping them out. As the loitering munition, Lancet 3 got these guys with a heat round, because the heat was very good against rubble positions, bunkers, as well as heavily armored vehicles, just like the Chinese CH-901A heat ammunition. As they moved forward, their troops were moving up with them, these two half squads on each side of this platoon. They moved up and they engaged these personnel because they were mutually supporting elements. They were firing at these forces with the vehicles behind firing as well when they were able to safely fire around their lead vehicle with their 12.7 millimeter machine guns. After clearing this building, the two squads went into each of these buildings and begun to hold their positions after they cleared them and fired out of the gutted parts down onto the streets to support their vehicles and the two half squads on each side who were firing around these rubbled corners. And after they KIA'd these troops and these troops up here, this half squad here, as the first 3 men of this half squad have been KIA'd, this other half squad moved in here and they all extended into a line formation to hold this rubble pile against the two Russian squads firing at them. Whereas this squad was moving in to reinforce them and to pick up the wounded, a shell landed here, here, and here. PLA 152 millimeter shells from the artillery battalion of the 38th Infantry Brigade. They destroyed this entire squad right here. But by that time, the other troops were deep embedded in the rubble here of this squad. Although these troops have been KIA, these three, the rest of them formed up in a line in this rubble and were relatively well entrenched when the artillery got these guys running through this open area, this alleyway between the piles, as they landed on the piles and got these guys. They didn't want to do it at danger close, though, because they didn't want to hurt their allies. And the Russians were again laying down enormous fire. By the time their vehicle got here, they were firing at these personnel in the rubble right here from around the corner and firing at these personnel. As you can see, this squad, as they moved out of the area here with the manhole cover, they moved across the rubble to reinforce troops here, but they were being fired at around the corner and from in these buildings that had been cleared by Russian forces. As you can see, their green arrow is mostly encapsulated in blue as they're taking heavy casualties from this fight. And they can't retreat into the manhole cover by the time they get here, because now the artillery's landing here to deny them escape. And they end up surrendering anyway, because they had by then had lost all these troops to the Russians and forces back here to PLA artillery and the troops here to direct fire from the Russian BMP-3. As the fighting would continue on for quite some time, this MRAP right here gets destroyed by a Russian 100 millimeter shell. It destroys this MRAP that has just barely survived the edge of the rockets going off here. The 300 millimeter rocket strikes. It's gotten out of the way, but it still has red behind it because it took some shrapnel from the blasts that are impacting here. And had gotten out of the way, but as artillery struck, it was being badly damaged, but by then it didn't matter because the Russians destroyed it with a single 100 millimeter shell to the front of it and destroyed it. And also, as they did that, they prepared their next phase of the operation to advance against these forces once the artillery had been lifted, and they could do that. As the artillery was hitting all along this area here, as previously mentioned, all of this was destroyed by artillery fire. These two remaining office buildings and parking lot being completely leveled and destroyed. This building, savagely hit by 130 millimeter light artillery rockets, was already horribly gutted in the front, and anybody taking fighting positions in this building by this facing the attack had been KIA'd or horribly maimed in these attacks. These troops have by now been all destroyed by artillery fire, as these buildings were all nothing but cratered. And then the artillery strikes here gutted this building too, and this whole area was gutted. And the facade of it was gutted from all the constant stream of 130 millimeter rocket strikes. And the mortars didn't help much either. As this went on, just the clearance of these areas here went on for 2 hours, more vehicles would emerge from this now horribly defaced and collapsing parking garage as the first floor was still workable. More vehicles would come out, more troops would return to contest these blocks that were now being fought over, and the fighting would go on for many more hours, as this is only a single small segment of a very much larger battle that was occurring, as this is the fighting that is going on along this area right here. As the forces would gradually push their way in from two different sides, the Americans would become ever more squeezed. In the next video, it will show the fighting that occurred around the end of Day 2, the last pockets to fall in the Waco Battle. Next, in the next video. as the forces here were gradually attriting, meaning to wipe out, all the armed reactionary civilians and American military forces that were left in this city, in the downtown area, most of which belonging to the 143rd, with a very small component of mixed military elements that were being smashed with the troops of the 143rd by the Russian and Chinese PLA armored forces and mechanized infantry coming in from the southeast and east, as they would do the most out of all the forces present to finish off these mixed American elements, as well as the troops of the 143rd, the light airborne troops operating in the city that had been there since the start, before help had arrived from reactionary armed civilians and from mixed military elements